Hello, and thanks for joining us for this month's edition of The Scope of Things, a no-nonsense look at the realities and enigmas of clinical research based on those closest to the action who aim for great and, if need be, are willing to shake things up. I'm Deborah Borfitz, Senior Science Writer for Clinical Research News. In today's episode, I'll be speaking with Christopher Boone, Vice President and Global Head of Health Economics and Outcomes Research at Abbvie, who is a guru at putting real-world evidence to work in studies involving humans. Chris, it is so nice to have you as my first podcast guest of 2023. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Thank you for the opportunity to join you.
So, Chris, only over the past few years has pharmaceutical drug development changed to include real-world evidence more often, primarily to help researchers identify potential patients and create the right criteria for clinical trials. Since you are a self-described data hippie, I'd like to start off with your down-to-earth status update on how the industry is doing overall in terms of democratizing data in this way.
Oh, that's a very, 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 very good question. I think overall, if I had to give us a grade, I'll probably say we're a B minus. Yeah, it's not bad. I think so. I think we've progressed tremendously over the last several years. I've been in this long enough to remember when the concept of real world data and real world evidence was first utilized, right? And people across the industry still didn't fully understand what it meant. People were actually using the terms interchangeably, like they meant the same thing and they didn't. Mm-hmm. So it just shows that within the last 6 or 7 years, the tremendous strides that we made in the industry, I think that we're at a place where folks are really coming up with very novel use cases for how real-world data can be utilized to generate real-world evidence. We certainly have seen a tremendous amount of progress being made on the regulatory submission side. We've always been somewhat on the commercialization side of the house, but to think that we've done so much more in R&D has really been a pleasant surprise, and it's something that I've certainly personally have been advocating for years now. So I'm happy to see where we are in that space.
Okay, so this, I'm guessing, then started long before the 21st Century Cures Act that was enacted in December 2016, requiring the FDA to propose scenarios under which real-world evidence can meet regulatory standards, or it was just being used in a different way prior to then? Can you give us some of the backstory here, Chris?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you think about 21st Century Cures, some of those initiatives or activities were somewhat underway. Like, for example, if you look at many of the post-approval commitments that pharmaceutical or life sciences companies had, whether it be for safety or efficacy reasons, those were inevitably generating real-world evidence that would support a regulatory decision-making. I just don't think that there was a standardized sort of submission process of RWE at the time. And I think when you think about the 21st Century Cures Act, what it did was it sort of came in and said, okay, we're gonna focus on how can we better utilize real-world evidence to ultimately accelerate the regulatory decision-making process. How can we better utilize to build on that adoption of electronic health records and all those other things that we made from a lot of investments through the federal government earlier in the 2000s? How do we better utilize many of these platforms to support much of the regulatory decision making? And ultimately, how do we get to a space where we're continuously tracking how this therapy or this intervention is performing in the real world context? And so I think, I do think the 21st Century Cures Act was probably the single biggest catalyst for the expanded use of RWE, especially on the R&D side of the house. But I do think there were certain use cases where it was being used. This is just more of formalizing it and really sort of giving the industry the license to be able to think innovatively about how we could better utilize real world evidence going forward.
But it's certainly hard to control for variables in the real world in the same way, of course, you would do like in a clinical trial. setting. And that's sort of been the key holdup and concern, and ways to get around that has been the talking points around this primarily. Would that be true, or is it something different that has been holding us up until the last few years to really get serious on this?
Well, I think there's generally been confusion about it. I mean, if you on one hand, with the 21st Century Cures Act, one of the things that I absolutely love about it, it was pretty much a nonpartisan issue. It was a bipartisan support for that particular legislation. I mean, it was pretty much a Republican-led Congress at the time with a Democratic president and President Obama, and they got it done. So I mean, so from a political talking point perspective, unlike some of the other issues, this was not one of them, right? I think both parties very much took pride in the passing of this particular legislation, and they saw the benefit in it. I think when it comes to sort of other barriers to why we haven't seen greater adoption, I would almost say those are more systemic and more cultural than you think. I think that if you really think about real world evidence, and I always tell people, you have to think of it almost as not almost, it is a disruptive innovation, truly, right? I mean, it truly has the potential to challenge the status quo, the way that we've thought about doing drug discovery in the past, the way that we've done drug development in the past, and even the way we commercialize many therapies has all been challenged by just the opportunity for this data, for this evidence to influence decision makers in ways we've never seen before. There used to be a point when clinical trial data evidence was the primary source, and it's still the gold standard. I'm not undermining that, but that it was the primary source, the sole source almost in many of the clinical decisions, and now it's not, right? I mean, so now you have providers and payers and others who have access to real world data. They do their analysis, they generate real world evidence, and they see how it affects their populations, and they make decisions accordingly. I think, and so that's what I mean by disruptive. And even in terms of how you think about clinical trials itself, now you're hearing a tremendous amount of discussion around diversity in clinical trials, which obviously the only way you're going to be able to unpack that is through real world data and real world evidence. You're hearing a lot about the possibility of digital technologies being incorporated and doing more decentralized trials, more community-based trials, and pragmatic clinical trials. All these things are really predicated on I really think on three sort of disruptive innovations that we've seen. One is real world evidence. The other is the expanded use of all the digital technologies that we've seen, and more focus on healthcare and life sciences by many of the big tech companies in order to develop these tools. And then also sort of the resurgence, if you will, of artificial intelligence and machine learning as sort of an advanced analytical capability now that we have all this data, right? So I think the biggest barrier we got now is understanding that we're not going to know everything. Some of this does require shifting more to a sort of learning-based culture. It's not something that I think pharma itself has done very well, at least as it pertains to this. I mean, the pharmaceutical industry has done tremendous amount of great things. The list goes on and on in that space. But we've done clinical trials the same way for the last 5 decades, right? And so, and we've mastered that. So it's like asking that to be disrupted, it's a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah, we're doing well. To pivot it was always hard to see there's something better ahead. In the context of clinical trials specifically, the idea around real world evidence is to broaden sort of the story of a drug's value to patients, I believe. And of course, the function of health economics and outcomes research is about generating that evidence. Since this describes your role at Abbvie, please share with listeners how you go about choosing your data sources and de-identifying data, and what sorts of complications ensue during this search and find exercise.
If you had asked me this question 5 years ago, I probably gave you a different answer. I mean,
okay. Then and now. Okay. What you said 5 years ago, and what do you say now?
Well,
what did you learn?
Well, I think 5 years ago, because part of this is cultural influence too, right? Social cultural norms. Like what are the people really looking for? And I think right now in 2022, the issue of data privacy and how my data is being used is probably more prominent amongst the average citizen than it was ever before. I mean, when I think about it, 5 to 10 years ago, you mostly saw a lot of patient advocacy groups who were speaking on behalf of all patients, but the patients themselves may not have been as knowledgeable as many of those advocates were in sort of having these discussions. But now, I think that's different. I think even my dear mother, who knows nothing about it, may ask, like, what is my data being used for and why? Right? I mean, the question to ask. So it gets into a lot of your consent issues, and I think so. As we think about HEOR, which has been one of the obviously leading functions driving the generation of RWE, we have things to think about now that we probably didn't have to think about 5 to 10 years ago. And one of those issues is privacy and data security, and actually having a data strategy. Before, it used to be we treated data curation, it was almost a one-to-one relationship with a study, right? So if you had a study, you developed a protocol, you went and you got the right data for that study, and that was it. I think now where we shifted to is creating health data platforms, where it allows us to do many studies from one data set, right? And so it's much more coordinated, it's much more strategic, it's much more enterprise thinking. And honestly, it's really around, doing a number of studies that range from, whether it be natural history studies, whether it be studies to understand the current standard of care, whether it be comparative effectiveness studies, comparative safety studies for many of our folks in epidemiology, you name it. But the point of it is that we can use very similar, if not exact, data sets in order to do many of these things, which was not the case before. I think another element to this is that we now have very, very different types of data. For us, before, it was primarily administrative claims data. That was the cleanest data. It was structured. It was much easier for us to access. Generally, we didn't have as many issues around data quality. But now there's greater interest in sort of the outcomes, the clinical outcomes of many of the therapies. And so you have to now really utilize the clinical data. You also have to be willing and thinking of a strategy that addresses the patient-generated data, which includes now, PROs, or patient-reported outcomes data, which includes patient experience data, which includes like the health and treatment history. If you think about it, much of the data we care about is captured outside the walls of the provider environment now, right? It used to be that we only had access to data that was within a provider environment, but now with with all of the digital technologies, you can really understand the environment and the experience of a patient at real time, and I think that's ultimately what we're going to get to. I still think the idea of using the cost and utilization data will always be paramount and critical for what we do, because again, the value discussion is part of it is economic. It's clinical as well, but it is economic. And so having that sort of insight is critical and important. We've had a pretty aggressive strategy with establishing patient registries. And the great thing about patient registries is that they go very deep and they're longitudinal around a specific disease area or therapeutic area, right, or condition. And I think that's really where you're seeing the difference now. Before, when you asked me like 5 years ago, we were just trying to, I remember I made a statement that pharma was in a sort of a data arms race, right, where we were really literally trying to just acquire and buy any and all data that we possibly could, even if that data made no sense at all, right? It was just about accumulating and amassing as much data as we can. I think now the industry has gotten much more mature and we're much more targeted. We're much more thoughtful in how we're going to utilize the data. So therefore, you become much more strategic in the data you want to target, the partnerships you want to form, and how that data will ultimately be utilized. And we do an annual review process of all the data assets we have and figure out which ones make the most sense and to now and in the future. And then we make decisions as to if we want to continue with those assets or not. And that's all part of it.
Yep. And I'm going to pivot here really quickly because I read in the news recently that you were appointed to the governing board of the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, where the mission is to help patients and their caregivers make better informed health decisions. So I'm wondering, what kind of crossover does this have, or might it have, with your real-world evidence generating work objectives going on at Abbvie?
Yeah, I think there's some crossover. I mean, but let me say this first. I mean, I've always been a huge fan of PCORI from the point of its inception and its mission,
Yeah,
and
same.
find it to be a great honor for me to be able to serve on the board of governors. And I wouldn't have thought that years ago that I would be in this position, but I'm certainly humbled by the opportunity to serve on the board of governors for PCORI. But when you think about the origins of PCORI, I always thought of it as the organization that would sort of fund, drive, and enable a lot of the comparative effectiveness research that was needed with many of the medical interventions that were out there. And so it's almost like, if you want to make it sort of analogous, I would almost say they were the HEOR department for the federal government, right? I mean, they were our peer group. And what they've done with the sort of board of governors is they've comprised a very transdisciplinary group of folks, right? From all the different sectors within the industry, from all different sort of professions and disciplines and trainings, and so we all get the great honor of serving on this board. But as it pertains to my work at Abbvie, there's not a direct connection other than myself.
Okay.
But I will say that PCORI itself, even with the PCORnet, which is their data infrastructure, has the ability to sort of generate real-world evidence, and in addition to sort of funding much of the work that's happening across the country. So I think they play a very vital role, and I think that again, that's sort of seems to get bipartisan support of PCORI and its mission too. And they have great leadership, a great mission, a great organization, and they're doing a tremendous amount of some great work. So I think it's really good, and I think it's good that they're open to having pharma representation on their board. So it should show that they're committed to this work too.
Yeah. So we got PCORI, we have regulators, we have payers, we have physicians, everyone demanding that real world evidence be used and be put to practical use to improve healthcare for all, and to make sure that the medicines we develop, are justly developed for all, if you will. And I'm wondering about if you could elaborate a little about how these changes in mindset and these voices that are speaking forth on this topic have led to some real value adds in terms of making clinical trials, in fact, more patient-centric, not just theoretically, but in fact, more patient-centric.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I always like to say in terms of patient engagement, I think that what the conversation around creating patient centricity has forced industry to do is to think about how do we more proactively engage with the patient community and make their voice heard and to pull through. From an HOR perspective, we've done that. We have, we've established a patient-centered outcomes research center of what we call center of expertise, led by one of my great colleagues, Robin Carson, within our organization, and that's really around sort of ensuring that we're able to reflect the patient voice in many of our study protocols, and making sure that we have that pull through of that patient experience data that's generated to effectively make decisions. We've even had some recent successes where some of the PROs that we developed were included in the labels of certain therapies, the drug label of certain therapies, which is a huge thing, right? So in addition to sort of the efficacy and safety of the therapy, you also had the patient experience or patient reported outcome included there as well. I think that, but generally, I think engaging with the patient communities and having them understand, even providing input and perspective over how we should be designing trials going forward, right? I think the whole rise of the decentralized trials is almost sort of consequential to that narrative, to that discussion, right? That the vast majority of these patients don't live within a reasonable driving distance to many of these sites, and it makes it very difficult for them to even if you're able to recruit them and consent them, it's hard to retain them, right? And so I think the idea of the decentralized trial was pretty much predicated on community-based sites, easy to get to, with sort of a hybrid model of going to the clinical site if and when necessary, sort of and also utilizing much of the telehealth technologies in order to enable that.
Right.
I think that's all sort of spurred by this movement towards patient centricity. That hasn't always been the incentive, right? I mean, because initially the incentive has been historically that we wanted to get the drug approved as fast as we could, and try to manage the cost that it takes to develop those drugs as best we can, as well. And so now, even with the sort of the discussions around patient centricity, you also get into the discussions around the diversity piece and they being able to reach what would be otherwise unreachable populations to be part of your trials too. So I think that when you think about the trial, I just think that it's really going through a period where we can reimagine the clinical trial in a different way, using sort of a combination of different techniques and technologies to make it better for all patients.
Very good. Okay. What about some actual business gains? I mean, can we put some dollars and cents to this, or some statistics in any sense at all that have come from the use of real world evidence in a clinical trial and the success of drug development itself? I don't know, cost and resources, however you might want to, frame this, or is that asking too much of the available real world data to be able to, generate that kind of,
I don't think it's really asking too much, because I think that it's a fair question. I mean, I think generally, but it's truly on a case by case basis, and really, even at the Scope conference, I mean, my talk is really centered around how do we do this all faster, better, and cheaper, right? So the principle is that the business cases that you can do it faster, better, and cheaper. That's why you're doing it. But I think just the material gains that you get. I mean, generally, anytime any RWE study you do, it is faster than doing a trial. Now, it's debatable by some as to whether the quality is higher or not, right? And some of the confounding factors, and whether that evidence that we generate would be acceptable to regulators, which is hence the reason you have the 21st Century Cures Act, going back to one of your original questions. But I think to sort of standardize the process for what would be acceptable to the regulators from an RWE perspective is what we're all seeking. And once we get that, then I think it becomes much more meaningful. But I think there with the studies that we've seen, it's not uncommon to shave years off the time it would take. I think one of the best examples to look at what we saw here recently with the pandemic and the vaccine, right? Typically, a vaccine would take 12 to 15 years of development time. I mean, anywhere from $2 to $3 billion to generate under normal circumstances, right? And then you had those organizations that were able to do it in what was less than 12 months' time. I mean, that's like record-breaking time. And a lot of that was enabled with the use of real-world evidence. And I think that's like the perfect case study for how RWE can be used and should be used in the drug development process going forward.
As you just alluded to a moment ago, I want to make sure listeners didn't miss this. You're going to be speaking at Scopes. That's a summit for clinical ops executives in early February. And your topic is on how to effectively utilize real world evidence for informing regulatory pathways. So I'm hoping you can give us maybe a little sneak peek of the types of things you'll be talking about. I'm guessing this might include the growing popularity of using real world evidence to replace the traditional standard of care comparator arm in like oncology and rare disease trials, as well as maybe more novel uses in the product development process. Tell us more.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's really going to talk. I'm just going to go from the point of how we can reimagine, sort of our clinical discovery and clinical development efforts utilizing real world evidence, and what many of the novel use cases are for doing just that. And we'll walk through strategically how an organization should be thinking about it, how they should be organizing themselves around it, and even some of the key lessons learned that we've seen over the last several years, and things that people can avoid, right? I mean, the benefit of being a first mover is that you're a first mover. The downside is that you have to absorb and learn all the tough lessons that others may be able to avoid when they come after you. And I think that but that's just a risk you're willing to accept. And I think that what I hope to do is to sort of initiate dialogue around the science of building these sort of functions and capabilities and how we can do it at scale, right? I mean, I think one of the challenges that we've seen with people, one of the criticisms of the use of RWE is that it's sort of a one-off and it can't be scaled to be sort of standardized, if you will. I think the regulators believe it can be. I also believe it can be. But in order to do that, you have to invest, you have to organize yourself, you have to be clear about your strategy, and you have to go through the necessary cultural transformation in order to build that out. And so these are all things that we'll talk about. Obviously, I won't shy away from the issue around sort of a health equity and diversity issues, because I know that that's a big part of this too.
Absolutely.
Round it all up with all of those things. I feel like I'm talking through my outline right now.
Well, we don't want to give it all away. But I, for one, can't wait to learn more, Chris. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. I'm sure the topic of real-world evidence and all its real-world complexities will be a trending topic throughout the upcoming conference. Borrowing the good luck words so often expressed to performers as they make their way to the stage on opening night, break a leg.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
And as always, a big thank you to everyone out there for listening in. Chris is one of an impressive lineup of keynote speakers for the upcoming Scope event being held February 6th through February 9th in sunny Orlando, Florida. It is always one of the biggest gathering spots for the clinical research community around collaboration and innovation, and you can register online using discount code SOT23 and receive 15% off any current registration rate. Simply visit scopesummit.com. Bye for now.